Ah, rock and opera. Two things that totally don't go together at all. Come on, man, I got into rock and roll because it was the furthest thing in the world away from opera. Yet, for some reason, some musicians just love jamming them together, resulting in rock opera classics like The Wall, Tommy, Quadrophenia, Ziggy Stardust, 2112, Kilroy Was Here, Joe's Garage, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and many, many more. And surprisingly, the results are usually good. And then Queen even quite literally combined the styles of rock and opera to create unique originals like Bohemian Rhapsody and Bicycle Race, and those results are amazing. And here we've got some footage from The Phantom of the Paradise, a 1974 rock opera film by Brian De Palma with music by Paul Williams that kind of transposes the concept of the classic Phantom of the Opera into a rock and roll world. It's great, you should totally watch it. All these mentioned are now rock opera classics, but we're not here to talk about them. No, if you couldn't tell from the thumbnail of Blackie Lawless with a chainsaw and Chris Oliva shredding on his metal axe, today we're going to be looking at some of my favorite, sometimes even heavy metal rock operas of the 80s and 90s. As always, I'll link the vids in the description if you want to hear them in full. Now, pass the Grey Poupon. Give that tuxedo a lapel tug or your evening gown a twirl, and let's enjoy ourselves a nice Night at the Rock Operas.
As I lost control, I swore I'd sell my soul.
Okay, there's just nowhere else for me to begin on this topic than Queensrÿche in their heyday, with their 1988 heavy metal rock opera, Operation Mindcrime. The first notable thing I want to say about this rock opera from an 80s prog band who we already talked about departing from prog in a previous video is that this masterwork of their prime is surprisingly very punk rock. Not so much punk rock in sonic qualities, but very punk rock in themes and spirit. And musically, for some big hair 80s metal, the music has some teeth. This single, Revolution Calling, has a mid-tempo tough swagger and groove with a somewhat snarling guitar riff. The gist of Operation Mindcrime is centered around this secret group of underground revolutionaries living under an oppressive empire rife with political corruption who are set out to dismantle and destroy it in rebellion. Our lead character, Nikki, struggles with a troubled life in the lower-class skids before getting drawn to the rebellion. The setting and story deal with drugs and addiction, economic injustice, desperation, revolt, a little love story, and more. Oh, and as the title suggests, mind control. That's where we kind of leap beyond the basic punk rock messages and introduce some sci-fi too. It's easy to imagine the visuals of Operation Mindcrime right in line with cyberpunk classics like Blade Runner and Neuromancer. If the shrieking vocals are a bit of a deterrent to you at first, let this rad aesthetic be your gateway in. That is a cool thing about singer Jeff Tate though. He just naturally has that whole belting, operatic verbosity inherent in his singing. In my opinion, it's the perfect vocal style for delivering such tales of technological damnation and woe. This single, Spreading the Disease, picks up the pace and gets us into Maiden-like territory. The Reich may not be the first band you think of when you think of power metal, but they can go there and they can do some damage. There's also an F-bomb that gets bleeped out at some point. Edgy. Well, you know, we're talking about the houses of ill repute and the underbelly of the beast on this one, so it goes with the territory. So, with Operation Mindcrime, there was never a movie, but there was a home video release called Operation Live Crime, with the band performing the entire album and little pre-filmed story vignette clips peppered in here and there. But it's easy to imagine a cool, goofy movie could have been made somewhere in the era of Total Recall, Demolition Man, Johnny Mnemonic, and all that. It also could have been a horrible abomination. Anyway, a question that I think will be fun to ask about these rock operas is, did it end in tragedy? And sadly, the fate of our lead Nikki is, well, not good. This one actually begins where it ends, alone and confused in a mental hospital. Bummer. Next, let's talk about Savatage and their 1991 rock opera called Streets, a rock opera. It's in the name. This one's about a washed-up, drug-dealing ex-rock and roller who gets another chance to rise again from the dingy streets of New York City. It's classic in all its themes and what it sets out to tackle. Talents, gifts, addictions, vices, chances, meanings, hopes and dreams, and the great struggle of artistry. This single, the only video, called Jesus Saves, is not religious in nature. Downtown Jesus is the nickname of our lead character, and he's a drug dealer, so Jesus Saves means, you know, he's got your drugs. Get it? Unlike Jeff Tate in Queensrÿche, who sang like the opera star himself, singer John Oliva's voice is raspy and ragged, and he kind of embodies the storyteller and mystic narrator. Almost like the Crypt Keeper even. I love it. He actually stayed in the band but replaced himself with a more operatic and trained singer after this album, Zach Stevens, who's great. But I've always kind of had a soft spot for John's shredded and emotive voice. You can hear this song has some heavy and tough riffage. But Streets doesn't really stay super heavy. In general, it's way more opera of a rock opera. There's piano ballads. There's lots of orchestrated passages. It really unfolds a lot more like a Broadway play or something, which I also think was probably something they had heavily in mind when writing it with producer Paul O'Neill. He also co-wrote the music and supplied the story itself, which was based on a book he wrote that was intended for an actual Broadway play in like '79. Streets is a very New York album, not just in setting but in scope and hope and design. So there was no movie, no home video, no Broadway play. Look, this hit in October of 1991. It was the most uncool thing in the world. We're lucky we got one music video. But there's a kind of interesting long tail to Streets. This was the first of several rock operas for Savatage, and on their second rock opera a few albums later, set in war-torn Sarajevo and called Dead When We're Dead, one of the tracks was a heavy metal rendition of The Carol of the Bells. I forget exactly how this works, but essentially it catches some waves on radio around the holidays and a light bulb goes off. The light bulb being the idea for the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, a heavy metal Christmas band of sorts. So that very same heavy metal Carol of the Bells that ends up on the first Trans-Siberian Orchestra album and going out to radio the following year, attributed to Trans-Siberian Orchestra in '96, that's originally a Savatage track off their second rock opera in '95. And I'm pretty sure all of Savatage play on that first Trans-Siberian Orchestra album, which is also a rock opera, and also the brainchild of producer Paul O'Neill and singer John Oliva. And it finally became their big, very extremely successful hit project. But anyway, we gotta get back to Streets for one more question. Does it end in tragedy? And I think the answer here is yes, with an asterisk. While our star can't handle and maintain his second rise from the rags, I think by the end of the line he's gleaned some perspective that prevents him from returning to the destitute place where we began. No longer as hopeless and broken, our hero carries on. It's kind of tragic, but it leaves us with hope. Alright, next up is another band I've already talked about in a previous video. If you told me that I'd be talking about both Queensrÿche and W.A.S.P more than once in videos on the internet, I'd have said kill me. But we definitely got to talk about W.A.S.P and their 1992 rock opera The Crimson Idol. And actually, there's something immediately interesting, which is that I think W.A.S.P is delivering the most commercial radio viable rock opera we're looking at so far. This single, Hold On To My Heart, really hit with all the big radio guns potentially blazing. It sounds good, has great backing vocals, a solid hook, but there's a caveat, a big one. This is 1992. This sounds like a really cool 80s pop metal radio rock opera with its sizzling guitars and verbed out drums. But not unlike Streets, it was also rapidly becoming uncool at warp speeds before it even hit the ground in '92. The story of the Crimson Idol is also somewhat similar to Streets. We have a basic ascent of a rock star named Jonathan Steele and all those same trials and tribulations. But this character comes from a family where he was the screw-up of 2 sons, and his prodigal brother was killed in a car crash. His parents view him as the failure, so he runs away from home to begin his journey that's both an upward trajectory and downward spiral at the same time. The main theme here that really sets it aside from Streets is that it's all about acceptance, particularly of Jonathan's parents. And there's definitely a lot more specific character development and cast of sorts, like Chainsaw Charlie and Dr. Rochter, which is cool. Blackie's voice is actually pretty suited to this kind of thing. He's not the operatic belter that Jeff Tate is. He's not the raspy crypt keeper that John Oliva is. He's kind of got just, I don't know, the underdog rock star hero's voice. And I've really come to appreciate his background vocal layering in general. In case I was too hard on them in my Rockers Going Industrial video, I ultimately think W.A.S.P rocks. They're just fun. This single, The Idol, is more of a tough-as-nails ballad. Different than a power ballad. The tough-as-nails ballad is kind of a unique move. Based in minor keys, dealing in dark matters, fist clenching harder than ever, but still an underlying sweetness and vulnerability to them. Kiss away the pain and leave me lonely. I'll never know the floods of life. Now, was there any movie to accompany this rock opera? Yes, but a decade and a half later. It played behind the band when they finally did the Crimson Idol tour 15 years later in 2007. Then, 10 years after that, in 2017, they released a whole re-recorded version of the whole rock opera called Re-Idolized. The re-recording doesn't sound as cool as the original, and I can only imagine it was for business reasons, but it does come packaged finally with the movie. Now, does the Crimson Idol end in tragedy? Well, Jonathan finally calls his parents to ask for their acceptance and is denied, so he hangs himself with his guitar strings. Heavy. Poetic. I do think Blackie Lawless was ultimately writing about how the adoration of a million fans or whatever doesn't really hold a candle to the reality of what actual love is like in one's own life. And we can all apply that lesson as we put weight on all our own different pursuits in our lives that we hope come to fruition. Will their potential success solve our own problems, or will we still feel that same void at the top of the mountain? Like Blackie sings, being crazy in paradise is easy. Do you see the prisoners in my eyes? Whoa.
It all began with the bright light and the noise. Chaos of the senses, and the scream of desire.
Oh man, this video is funny. Okay, let's look at one more, Marillion, with their 1994 album Brave. It's a rock opera about a girl standing on a bridge, wrestling with the urge to jump off of it and everything that led her there. Oh, and it might not be a rock opera, even though it is. Why not? Well, when a friend first gave me a CD of Brave to listen to, he didn't call it a rock opera. He called it a concept album. And I'm pretty sure that no promotional materials referred to it as a rock opera, but it totally is. See, in progressive rock, concept album is a term to recontextualize a rock opera. I guess add some sophistication to the whole ordeal. And indeed, here we're dealing with sophisticated themes: abuse, addiction, media control, and manipulation. Wait, these are just the themes of Operation Mindcrime. But Marillion's approach is unique. This single, Living with the Big Lie, is essentially saying the world sucks. It really sucks. It sucks in a whole lot of ways, and you gotta live in it. You never get over it. You get used to it. I will confirm this to be true. And from here we get the whole theme of the album, standing on the bridge, wondering, do we really want to be here? I love how Brave deals with all of these themes without being hard rock all turned up to 10. Guitarist Steve Rothery draws from the Stratocastered single coil well of David Gilmour more than big, humbucking hard rock gods. And singer Steve Hogarth, Marillion's second singer, which is a whole other story, has a voice that can emote over the more mellow and introspective soundscapes and rise to a crescendo, belting out over the band at their most revved up with sonorous passion. The fans call him Hoagie, and Hoagie is great. In the timeline of Marillion, he was also an ideal personality and voice to usher the band in through the 90s and onward. This single, Alone Again in the Lap of Luxury, is about being disenchanted with a financially well-off but dysfunctional and discontented family. Kinda relates to what Blackie might have been saying earlier there, huh? Now, was there a movie for Brave? Yeah, you're looking at it. In the case of Brave, they made a whole low-budget movie that's kind of just a long music video, and they put it out too. In the case of all these rock opera movies, when there even was one, there just was never the budget to really do it up. But they did what they could. And what about the ending? Does it end in tragedy? What they did with Brave is super cool. The double vinyl has a double groove on side 4, and depending on where your turntable needle lands, it goes into a tragic ending or happy ending groove, with totally different songs, one where the girl jumps and one where she lives and finds herself made again. The CD pressing contained only the happy ending, whereas the movie used only the tragic ending. I still think that double vinyl groove idea is one of the coolest uses of physical media in such a way, and I wish you saw more stuff like that. Brave's CD booklet instructed the listener to play it loud with the lights off, and I'll second that. Don't bother with the movie, just find the audio and crank it up in the dark. And with all that said, let's get out of here. I know there's a million more rock operas and concept albums we could look at. These are just some from my personal stash. What are some of yours? Shout them out in the comments. Maybe if we all had enough fun, we'll all get all dressed up all nice and fancy again like we are right now, and have ourselves another wonderful night at the rock operas sometime. For now, and until then, everybody get home safe, and don't forget to take some nice pictures while you look all fancy. Really, you look great. Cheerio.